I want to welcome everybody to the third and final week of our racial reconciliation series. This is being sponsored by the task force at Woodmont Christian Church for racial reconciliation. And the goal of this series has been to educate, to have dialogue, to hear from different people, to hear different perspectives. And tonight we are joined by a very special guest, Dr. Bernard Lafayette, and he's going to be introduced in just a moment. I do want to say that Karen Woolridge and Charles Robert Bowman are co-chairing our task force, and there are 4 areas. If you want to get involved after this series, we have 4 committees that are focusing on race history and education, church partnerships with other churches in the Nashville area, mentoring, and then economic opportunity. Those are the 4 areas that we're kind of focusing on. And so if you're interested in any of those, please let Karen or Charles Robert know, and we'll try to get you plugged in with the group that's working on those areas. I want to welcome everybody. I'm so thankful that we've done this series. I think it's been great. And tonight is going to be another wonderful one. A lot of people have said, why are you stopping? Well, we're doing 3, and then we'll take a break, and then we're going to do some more in the future. So we're stopping for now, but not for good. The first time that I got to hear Dr. Lafayette was through a group in Nashville, a group of businessmen that was kind of corralled by my friend Brock Kidd. His father, David Kidd, was a pastor in Nashville, still is a pastor, but served at Hillsborough Presbyterian for 35 years. David led all kinds of efforts in the area of racial reconciliation and building bridges. And so that was the first time that I got to hear and talk to Dr. Lafayette. David introduced me to somebody who is my new friend, Jane Osgerby, and she is on the line. And I'm going to, after I open this with prayer, I'm going to turn it over to Jane, because Jane has had a relationship with Bernard for a long time. And she's also been involved in civil rights leadership, nonviolent training. And so I'm thankful for her. Just to share a few more things about Jane. She is retired from the state of Tennessee Probation and Parole Department after serving for 34 years. She has an MS in Criminal Justice Administration. She's also a level 2 trainer in Kingian nonviolence, a volunteer in the community. I know she trained Karen in the nonviolence, MLK nonviolence method. And so she can say more about that. But again, I want to welcome everybody, and I'm going to ask you to mute up if you can. And I'm going to open with a short word of prayer. And then Jane, I'll turn it over to you to introduce our special guest tonight. So let's pray. Loving God, thank you so much for this series where we have heard from different voices and where we have grown and reflected upon the question, what can we do to continue the legacy of Dr. King and Dr. Lafayette and John Lewis and all the others that braved the way many decades ago? What can we do to build bridges? What can we do to make a difference? And so tonight, be with us as we discuss and as we grow and as we reflect. Thank you for this time together. In Christ's name, amen. Jane, glad to have you. I'll turn it over to you to introduce our special guests.
Thank you. Thank you, Clay, and thank you, Woodmont Christian, for taking on this most important and oftentimes frightening work. I'm honored to have a tiny part in this, and we definitely need it right now. I grew up in Tullahoma. My parents were always interested in the news, so we watched it on television and subscribed to the Tennessean. In 1960, I was 15 years old. So I began learning from the news about the lunch counter sit-ins that were taking place in Nashville. My family visited Nashville regularly, so I was familiar with the places that they were trying to get something to eat or drink in. And as I learned more about what they were doing, I somehow just knew that what they were doing and how they were doing it was somehow right. I've always had an interest in those methods ever since. Now let's fast forward 30 years to 1990. I was reading the fabulous book, Parting the Waters by Taylor Branch. and reading in the newspapers that it was the 30th anniversary of the sit-ins, and a reunion celebration was about to start at American Baptist College. Long story short, I took days off from work and attended every event that I could fit into. Workshops, musical programs, banquets, all the usuals. But at the same time, I was meeting and interacting with those very people I had admired from the 1960s and was reading about at the time. I've not looked back since. I followed that special occasion with a letter to Dr. Lafayette, who hosted the reunion, and I offered to volunteer. I told him I could stuff envelopes or drive people around, but he had much loftier notions for me. And here I am, 30 years again have passed, and I'm still volunteering. My life has been forever changed, learning from and becoming friends with not only the man, but his wonderful wife, Kate, who is with us tonight. She's right on camera with him, and all of their families. I'm going to leave it up to you to read and learn more about his life's work, which would fill up days of Zoom meetings. I do want to recommend his award-winning book, In Peace and Freedom, My Journey in Selma. And I want to introduce you to my dear friend and brother, Dr. Bernard Lafayette Jr.
Thank you, Jane. And Bernard and Kate, welcome. We're so glad to have you. Bernard is a great storyteller, and so I am going to I'm going to prod him along with a few simple questions, and then as always tonight, we'll save time at the end to try to open things up for questions. I think we have a lot of people on the line tonight, so again, if you can make sure you mute up. But Bernard, thank you so much for joining us. And Kate, thank you for joining us. Can you start off, Bernard, by just telling us what was your initial motivation for getting involved in civil rights and the civil rights work to begin with?
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'm so grateful to you and your organizations and working with this kind of thing. And I'm delighted, and I'm open for questions. I definitely like them. And your question starts off, well, I'm going to try to speak fast. I usually don't speak fast, but I will now because I want to preserve as much time as possible. The thing that I remember that motivated me to get involved in the civil rights movement was back when I was about 7 years old. And I lived in Tampa, Florida, in Ybor City, and my grandmother and I used to travel together. Oh, I used to stay on her dress tail, they said. They said, every time we look up, there he is, right there with his grandmother. And we traveled together, places where she went. I just was right there with her. And I learned a lot from her because I observed her and how she handled things. We used to have to board the streetcar, which is called the trolley car, in the front door, and we would deposit our fare in the receptacle there, and then we had to get off the streetcar and walk on the side of the in the street, and then we would have to enter the streetcar through the rear door, and that's how we got back on the streetcar after you paid your fare. Well, in this particular day, my grandmother and I had were traveling together, put our fare in the front, and as we got off, we used to run because sometimes the conductor would take our fare and then close the doors and then take off, and we would lose our fare and our ride. So I used to run ahead and I used to jump on the steps of the streetcar because if you got the steps down, the door couldn't close. Even though I didn't weigh very much, I could hold the steps down. And so on this occasion, I jumped up there. And my grandmother was running behind me. And she had on high heel shoes, and her heel got caught in the crack of the, around the track, and she fell. I mean, it was boom. I mean, she was a large woman. And when she hit that street, you know, I hopped off and tried to pick her up. And while I was doing that, the streetcar conductor closed the doors and took off. Age 7, little skinny fella, didn't even wear short pants in those days because I had such skinny legs. So I tried to pull her up, and with no, you know, success. And I felt just terrible. And I felt like a sword had cut me in half. And when I remember what happened is that I said something to myself that I will never forget. I said to myself, when I get grown, I'm going to do something about this problem. At age 7, I couldn't wait to get grown. And that was the thing, was my grandmother that really motivated me to challenge that system. I realized the system coming up at age 7, but I just decided that that was going to be my life's calling, to do something about this problem. So that was my actual beginning and commitment, and it was to myself. I made that commitment.
That's great. Can you tell us about, so fast forward a little bit, and can you tell us about how you first heard about Dr. King and then how you first met Dr. King?
Yes, well, I was actually in high school when the Montgomery bus boycott was going on, and I heard something about Martin Luther King then, and I was very much aware of what he was doing. But it was actually when I went to the American Baptist Theological Seminary in Nashville that I really got involved. And it was John Lewis, actually, who got me involved in the workshops that Jim Lawson was teaching in Lawson, Virginia. And I didn't want to go at first because I didn't want to no extra work, particularly no work and no shops or whatever. So he convinced me that I should come to the workshops, and I said, I'll go with you, okay? And we were roommates in college. So I went and I got hooked, and that's when I decided that this was my life's calling, and that was to really work on how we could change attitudes and change the behavior of people towards us, and change policies and even laws. In the South, you know, we had segregation laws, so it wasn't just some people acting the way they did. So that was the way I got started. I met Martin Luther King when he came to Nashville, and he spoke at Fisk University gymnasium, and I was just really thrown away just by his speeches and that kind of thing. And I remember one thing he said that really stuck with me the rest of my life. He said, I came not to bring, inspiration or whatever, but I came to gain inspiration. So he had been observing our movement in Nashville, and it had really caught his attention. And he began to watch how we behaved, because we desegregated the lunch counters there in 3 months. So the first group of those college students who actually, you know, desegregated their lunch counters. And that's why when SNCC was founded, the first chairman was from Nashville. That was Marion Barry. And of course, it was Chuck McDougall and John Lewis. So 2 of the first 3 out of the 3 first chairmen of SNCC came from the Nashville movement. And that's because of the leadership training we had received.
Wow. Anything else about your time in Nashville at American Baptist, jump out in your memory?
Yes. there were a lot of things that happened in Nashville. And one of the things that happened was that the lunch counters in the was downtown. They were downtown, and we decided that we would not exclude any of the lunch counters. So whether or not they were in department stores or whether they were actually just, fast food places, you know. And one of the places was the Greyhound bus station was downtown, and the Greyhound bus station had lunch counters. So we did not exclude them. So in 1960, when the downtown sit-ins took place and the department store lunch counters were desegregated, the Greyhound bus station lunch counters and the train station were also desegregated. So it was in 1960. So that was before the Freedom Rides. And once they desegregated the lunch counters at the bus station, it didn't make sense to have segregated waiting rooms or either restrooms. So they desegregated the entire bus station in 1960. Yeah.
And did you first meet John Lewis in Nashville?
Yes. We were both students at the American Baptist Theological Seminary in Nashville. And we ended up being roommates. Yeah.
Roommates, that's right. Okay. So fast forward a little bit, and can you tell us about Selma? Tell us about going to Selma, and obviously you talk about this in your book, but tell us about what happened there and what your experience was there. And I believe the fact that you were targeted for assassination in Selma. Can you talk about Selma some?
Yes. Well, after the Freedom Rides were stopped with violence, those of us in Nashville took up the Freedom Rides, and we completed those Freedom Rides, and we desegregated the buses, the rest of the Greyhound buses and that kind of thing. We decided that, well, if we were able to accomplish as much as we had accomplished in Nashville and the Freedom Rides, what if we took off for a couple of years, like, they did for the Peace Corps, Vista Volunteers or whatever? We could be a staff for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and that would be a way for us to get sort of practical learning as well. And so we decided we would be the staff of the SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So I went down to get my assignment because I wanted to do, voter registration. And so when I went down at first, it was James Foreman who told me that what they needed was somebody to raise money to get Dion Diamond out of jail because he was in jail in Louisiana, and they had required him to have a $10,000 cash bond. Okay? And so that was because we made a commitment to each other. And that was that if something happens to one of us, we would always know that we could depend on each other. So we wouldn't leave anybody in jail. We'll either try to get them out. If that wasn't possible, we would join them in jail. And so Detroit was where I went, and we raised the money for Detroit. In the meantime, Mike Dew and Bob Zellner went down to visit, and they got arrested. And you know what the charge was? Dion Diamond individually, and then the other two, when they went to visit, conspiracy to overthrow the state of Louisiana because black people were trying to register to vote. Conspiracy to overthrow the state, okay? And so we had to go to Chicago and raise another $20,000 to get them out of jail. Well, I went to get my assignment in Atlanta, and James Foreman, who told me he was going to give me an assignment, said they didn't have any more. directorships. I could go and work with Bob Moses and be his assistant, or Charles Sherrod down in Southwest Georgia. Okay, and I said, wait a minute, hold it. I want to be a director of a project. I'm 22 years old, and at 22 I have to be director of something. Okay, so let's find a place. No, they had an X through Selma, because 2 different teams of snake workers went down to Selma, Alabama, came back, and said nothing could be done. No, and they had the same reason. They said that the white people in Selma were too mean, and the black people were too scared. Scared black folks, mean white folks, nothing could be done, because they were really just sort of, very comfortable. And you know what happened? The black folks' rationale was that politics was dirty. And they were Christians, and they just said they would not get their hands dirty with politics. That's what they considered, voter registration. And they were fine. They said, we don't need anything down here. So I had to, James Foreman said, now if you want to go take a look at it, I said, no, I don't want to take a look at it. I will take it if nobody else wants to go. I will take it. And my research, and this is one of the lessons I want to share.
He's talking.
It's important. Oh, that's my son. Lafayette. I don't know where he came from.
Oh, good. Welcome.
Yeah, okay. His name is Bernard too. All right, but he's Bernard 3. So he's Bernard also. So I decided I had to do some research before I go just jumping up and running to Selma. And the research was when I was in Atlanta, the research was where was I going to do my research? That's the first research. Well, long story short, I found that the library at Tuskegee Institute, that's university now, was the only place where I could go, a library that had publications, a monthly publication of the White Citizens Council. Because I had to study and learn more about, my people. Now, as I continued to study there at, I'm here now, at Tuskegee, Ralph Ginsburg was in the same library, in the same stacks with me. He's the one that went back to New York and wrote the book, 100 Years of Lynching. So we worked together in the library and shared information. I found a lot of articles for him, and he found a lot of information for me, articles, and we exchanged that. And he went back and wrote a book, and I headed on down to Selma because I wanted to learn as much as possible. I learned a lot of things about that, and if we want to go into detail, we do that. But the most important approach that I used, since I knew that there was a lot of resistance towards voter registration on the part of the black people, I didn't go in telling them that they need to go register to vote. I carved out a strategy, and I'll just share one now if you want to hear more later.
Sure.
But rather than telling them to go register to vote, what I did was ask them what did they think was the biggest problem in Dallas County, or Selma, Alabama. And there were those who said, well, the roads are not paved. You can tell where black people live because they have dirt roads. They're not paved. They don't give the same kind of attention, to the community and where we live and that kind of thing. Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Went to another black person. What do you think is the biggest problem here? See, well, one of the problems is that, we don't have decent schools. The amount of money they spend on, white schools is far more than they do on the black schools. And, our children are not getting an equal education. And the schools are segregated. And they make sure that, they don't get the kind of books and the kind of other things that they need to operate with, and they don't, give them that kind of support. And nor do the teachers get paid. Same. Wow. Okay, thank you very much. So what do you think is the biggest problem in Selma? Another person would say, we don't have electricity in certain black communities. The low-income communities? No, we can play the radio, but we can't have no television. We play the radio because we get batteries. And we don't have electric irons to iron our clothes because we have to use pot, those, hot plates and stuff like that to, heat our irons because we have, iron boards, but we don't have electricity. Okay, right. Went back around, said, okay, so these roads, how do you think, who decides what roads get paved? The folks downtown. Oh, people downtown. Which ones? What people? Those folks on the city council. Those people who run the government, etc. Oh my goodness, they decide that? Yeah. How did they get in those positions? Oh, I see. They were voted in, huh? I see. So I let them tell me, okay? Because once you get into a person's head, what you have to do is allow and give them room to think things through. And you have to also help people fulfill their concerns. It has to be their concern, not yours.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the approach that I used in getting them motivated to register to vote. It was something they were concerned about, a condition that exists.
So basically, you did your research, you went around and talked to the people, you listened to them, and then you got them to see that you can influence who gets into these positions to make these decisions.
Yes, because of things that they are concerned about. So it has to be their concern.
So Bernard, when you were targeted for assassination, was that when you were in Selma? It was the same time that that Medgar Evans was killed. The same night they had also targeted you as well. What did you find out later about that?
Well, the FBI came and told me after I was attacked that night, and they were actually trying to get me to go further down in the community because there was a mob that was waiting for me. And the FBI told me that they were going to do an Emmett Till on me. That was that they were going to actually, destroy and cut on my body and then throw me in the river because there was the Alabama River, okay, right there in Selma. That was their plan, according to the FBI who reported. But that particular night, there were 3 of us they had targeted. The third person was in Louisiana, and that was Ben Elton Cox. He was with the Congress of Racial Equality, and the FBI. And I don't just say in my book, the FBI, I give a name. of the agent, okay, who came and talked to me. I parked in front of my house coming from a mass meeting and was getting papers out of the back seat of my car. And across the street from my house, there was a car, and there were two white men, one in the hood and the other under the steering wheel. So I didn't pay any attention to them because it was a white community, you know, right down the street from me. So I saw whites all the time coming by my house. But then, while I was in my back seat pulling things out, I heard footsteps coming behind me so that I could hear the leaves cracking. So I jumped out of my car, turned around, and there this man was standing in front of me, huge. And he had a crew cut, t-shirt, sleeves rolled up on top of his shoulder. And he looked down at me because I was much smaller. And I looked up at him and he said, "Buddy, how much would you charge me to give me a push?" So I told him I wouldn't charge him anything. So I got my car and backed it up and got behind him. Had a 48 Chevrolet, okay, that Julian Bond had got for me. Huge tires, you know, metal doors, because he knew I was going to be in rural areas and stuff in the South, you know, with voter registration. And he thought that was the best car for me. So I had high bumper guards. So I matched them up. And the guy looked down and he kept looking. And I said, "Do they match?" And he said, "You better come out and take a look." Well, since I wasn't going to charge them any money to give a push, okay, because after I gave them the push, then they would have really given me more than money. I wouldn't have gotten any money, but I would have gotten something else. They decided to go ahead and knock me out. So this huge guy, as I was bending over, came and smashed me in the head, and I fell straight and I stood back up again. And he hit me the second time, and I went flat down, rolled over, and got back up again. The third time he hit me right in the top of my head, and I went straight down. By this time, I really couldn't see him, but I was looking towards him, but the blood was dripping down over my eyelashes and everything. So he, when I looked then, he got nervous and started shaking, and then he started backing up because he had thought that a couple of knocks would have knocked me out, a little small fellow like me. And I realized that when he started backing up, he had a gun. Now he decided he was going to shoot me. And I realized that, you know, I didn't have much of an option. So I turned around with my back to him, and I yelled for my neighbor, "Red, Red, Red." And Red came across the banister, okay, with a shotgun, a rifle. I think it was a rifle. And he'd been to Vietnam and Korea as a military person. And he was trying to get a beam on this guy and trying to get around me. And wherever I saw him go, I blocked it. I said, "Don't shoot, Red, don't shoot." And I was shielding the guy who had the gun behind me. Had I moved out of the way, he would have had a clear shot. But I refused to move because I wanted to protect the guy behind me who was going to kill me. And this guy eventually jumped in his car and they took off. This is an example of a nonviolent approach to dealing with conflict. And when you realize that there is a possibility of your opponent even being killed, do what you can to save the life of everybody. So I was protecting him, and it's not impossible, but it's improbable that somebody will shoot their shield. Someone who's shielding and protecting them, you would shoot them. So it's a practical, nonviolence is practical.
So Bernard, there's so much more. I want to come back to the nonviolent approach and how you went on to establish all these schools and have trained so many people. But you got to meet Martin Luther King Jr. and you traveled with him, and you actually got to be, in his inner circle. So can you talk about the relationship that you had with Martin? And then I also want you, a lot of people on this call may not know it, but you were in Memphis the night before and the day that Dr. King was shot. So I'd love for you just to talk a little bit about your relationship with Martin Luther King Jr. and what you learned from him, and then we can talk about Memphis and what he said to you there.
Well, one of the things I did after I laid the groundwork for Selma and got the Selma movement started, I used to often hear Martin Luther King talk about going north and getting the movement going there, because this racism and prejudice and all of these kind of terrible, behaviors towards, black people and colored people was not just relegated to the South, but we had these sections in the North that also, and we still do, have serious kind of discriminatory behavior, which ruins the lives of people. Think about children having to grow up in these kind of circumstances, stuff like that. The lives will be totally different. So I wanted to go to Chicago. I wanted to go north. So the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, are the ones who started a position, and they recruited me to go to Chicago, for their community-based organization. And so I was in Chicago. In fact, I have to share this since we talked about Selma. I trained the group of gang members in Chicago to go to Selma to become marshals, because I knew that once we get a movement going in Chicago, the gang members are going to do their thing. So rather than that, I wanted to give them a specific role to play. So I trained them and sent them to Selma, Alabama. And when you look at some of the photos of people in Selma March, there's one that you could remember because it's in a lot of museums. And it's a black fella carrying an American flag. He got a black tam on, and he is there in front of Martin Luther King and Mrs. King and Abernathy and Shuttlesworth and those. And his name is Lamar McCoy. A lot of folks don't know his name because they just saw the photo. Lamar McCoy was the head of the Vice Lords from Chicago. So those Chicago gang members were there. And we had trained them in nonviolence so that they could be marshals on the Selma March. So we focused on in the slums in places like Chicago and blockbusting and stuff like that. That's where Jesse Jackson was recruited,
Mm-hmm.
In that movement and stuff like that. We had a coalition of people, union folks. Addie Wyatt, for example, was the woman who was head of one of the labor unions. And so my point is, the same approach that I used in Selma, I used it in Chicago. So dealing with the people who lived in these slum areas and stuff like that, they had to take some initiative. So the people who are the victims must also stand up, and then others will join them, because the whole strategy in the movement, like Napoleon says, no revolution has ever been won without winning the sympathy, if not the active participation of the majority. So Martin Luther King's strategy in terms of nonviolence had to do with winning people over and supporting okay, worthwhile causes, and doing it in a nonviolent way. So that was part of the whole way of accomplishing the goal.
Mm-hmm.
Not enough just to say things are bad and I don't like them and I protest them. No, we've got to use strategies for change.
And that wasn't, you had your group and Dr. King. You also had Malcolm. You had Malcolm X, and that was not necessarily his strategy. He was much more open to violence and said that wasn't convinced that nonviolence would work. But yet history has shown that it was your approach that made the difference. So can you say more before you talk about Memphis? Can you say more about why you became so convinced that was the way to go?
Well, I'll let Malcolm, since you brought up Malcolm X, I'll let him tell you. Malcolm was invited to speak at Tuskegee Institute, okay, while the Selma movement was going on. And after he spoke to the student body, he came down to Selma, Alabama. I was there. It was only like less than a couple of weeks before he himself was killed. And he went to see Martin Luther King in jail, but they would not allow Martin Luther King, allow Malcolm X to see Martin Luther King. So since he was there, and people got so excited about Malcolm X, they heard about him, but nobody ever expected to see him, and there he was in Selma, Alabama. So we came up with the idea I was wanting to hear him speak because I wanted to know why he wanted to see Martin Luther King. He came all the way. That was out of his way. The airport's in Montgomery. He came all the way to Selma. Instead of going to the airport where he was scheduled to leave, he decided to change and come to see Martin Luther King. And so I wanted to hear what he had to say. So I got involved, and like I usually do, and we got some discussion going. And there were those who said, no way. So we negotiated, and we got people to agree, the leadership there, that Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth from Birmingham, he was there, and he would be the first one to speak at the mass meeting. So we organized a mass meeting right in the project, Brown Chapel. And Malcolm then would speak after Shuttlesworth, because Shuttlesworth would set the tone. And then Mrs. King was there, Coretta Scott King, and she would be the one that would speak after Malcolm X, just in case if things got, too riled up. She would represent, people would listen to her because she was, very much a leader in the movement. I don't remember what all the others said, but I do know what Malcolm said, some of the things. One thing I remember Malcolm X said, and he was speaking to the media. So he was pointing down at the media. They had cameras on him, and that kind of thing. They were right. He said, you had better listen to Martin Luther King. These are words that came out of Malcolm X's mouth. You had better listen to Martin Luther King. Because if you don't, you're going to have to listen to me. Okay?
Wow.
But he also said this, that when he got back to Harlem, he was going to name his assassins. That was, I even have that feeling now that I had then, that he was going to name his assassins. But the most important thing he said, he told them to listen to Martin Luther King. Malcolm never organized no armed militia to go and kill any white people. So while he said that the whole issue about self-defense and that kind of thing, he never initiated any kind of violence towards, even the people who would have been his assailants. In fact, he refused, and I only learned this as of late, to have people searched when they came to the mass meeting. I thought they were being searched, and there were people who wanted to, some of his personal things, but he refused because he wanted them not to have to go through that. So now here's a point I want to make. Had both of them lived, I firmly believe that Malcolm would have, learned more about Martin Luther King's approach. And maybe, because he broke with Elijah Muhammad. And Stokely Carmichael was the same way. I knew Stokely very well. In fact, we were cellmates in jail down in Mississippi on the Freedom Rides and stuff like that. We didn't sleep at night because we argued all night. But anyway, but the very fact that he was willing to discuss it, because some people are so convincing, they don't want to hear anything different. But we must look for opportunities to look at the opposites and be able to appreciate the differences,
Right. What was your relationship with Dr. King like? When did you really, you first met him in Nashville, but you didn't get to know him until later. So how would you describe the friendship that you had with him and that you developed?
Well, I was totally unaware that Martin Luther King was paying any attention to me. But we've been in meetings before. Well, like even on the Freedom Rides, one of the meetings we had was at the Harris's house in Montgomery, and it was a debate about whether Martin Luther King should go on the Freedom Rides. Martin Luther King did not volunteer to go on the Freedom Rides, and he was not, convinced that he should. But I didn't want him to have to argue that for himself, so I took on the argument. Martin Luther King, during the Freedom Rides, was out on probation in Georgia, and he had been arrested and put in jail, and he was in Reedsville, Georgia, on the chain gang. They put him on a chain gang because he hadn't changed his driver's license when he moved from Montgomery to Atlanta.
Montgomery to Atlanta, yeah.
Yeah, and it was Kennedy who called the local judge, and after talking to Mrs. King, and they let him out, but he was out on probation. Had he gotten arrested on the Freedom Rides, he would have been taken back to Reedsville, Georgia, for violation of probation. So it didn't make sense for him to do that. And besides, we need him out meeting the media and the press and being able to interpret what we're doing and helping to recruit more people to come and join us on the Freedom Ride. So there are roles for different people at different times. This was not the time for Martin Luther King to go to jail. So my point is, I developed a relationship. He was observing me all the time. I didn't know it. And then he saw me in Chicago and said that he wanted me to come down to Atlanta because they were going to reorganize and restructure the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Well, I had a good job with the Quakers in Chicago, and they would even give me a leave of absence to go and work with him, but I didn't want to leave my good job. They had a lot of benefits and stuff like that. But they even had paternity leave. Paternity, that's the husband's leave,
Right.
Don't even have a child. Well, retirement and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
But Martin Luther King did not give up. So he asked Andrew Young to send me a letter, and Andrew didn't get the letter out in time, so he called me. Martin Luther King called me and told me, when was I coming down? Whoa. somebody like Martin Luther King tell you to come, you know. I said, well, okay, if you say so, I'll be there. So I said, could you send me a job description? And Martin Luther King says, yes, you could get a job description. Come on down and write one. He told me I could write my job description. And actually, he appointed me the program administrator, which meant that I supervised all of the program staff. Hosea Williams, okay, Dr. Cotton, okay, T.Y. Rogers, okay, and who else? Jesse Jackson. I was his supervisor.
You were Jesse Jackson's supervisor.
Yeah, Jesse goes around and tell people I trained him. I said, Jesse, don't tell people that. But anyway, Martin Luther King saw something in me, and I didn't know that he was observing me, but he wanted me to do that. And then he turned around and appointed me, as you know, the national coordinator of the Poor People's Campaign. That was his idea. Okay. And that's what he wanted to do. And
so fast forward to April of 1968. You went to Memphis, and you were there with him. So can you talk to us a little bit about Memphis and what you all did in Memphis, and then kind of tell the story from there?
Well, we were in a meeting in Atlanta, and that's our staff meeting with all of those people I just mentioned. Mm-hmm. And we were planning for the Poor People's Campaign. And he got a call from Memphis. And
Ray, come here.
He wanted to, they wanted him to come and help lead a march, make a speech to support the sanitation workers strike. And they had a union, and they were trying to get recognition, and they were trying to get, more support for the sanitation workers. And they had very low paid jobs, and a lot of them got injured on the job, and they didn't have any insurance, to help them and that kind of thing. So Martin Luther King was in the middle of planning for the Poor People's Campaign, and those people will be an example of the working poor. So he responded, Jim Lawson and others called him, and he was just going to go and come back. But when he got there and they had the march, there was a group that got downtown and broke out windows and started out of violence and stuff like that. And that was not the kind of image that Martin Luther King wanted to leave. So we in Atlanta, the staff, went to Memphis so we could do the march over again and do it peacefully and non-violently. So that's why we were all there at that march and demonstration. So the short of it is that Martin Luther King was scheduled to go to Washington, D.C. to have a press conference announcing the opening of the office on 16th and U at the Poor People's Campaign office. And since I was the head of the Poor People's Campaign, Martin Luther King was going to send me. So that night, for example, when he spoke his mountaintop speech, I was at the hotel working on the press statement for him when he got returned. When he did return, he was so excited about the following and the way the people, because that night when we were at the hotel, he wasn't going to go to that meeting. And he got a call from Abernathy, and he said, Abernathy said, you got to come. The people want to hear you. This is your crowd. They don't want to hear us. So he got up. He said, you want me to get up out of my bed, take off my pajamas, and get dressed? And Abernathy said, yes, this is your crowd. So he did. But when he returned, he was so excited, we couldn't work on a press statement. So we had to do it the next morning. So it was April 4th now, the morning of April 4th. And we finished up and polished, as we say, polished the statement, press statement. And as I went to leave out to go catch a plane to go to Washington, Martin Luther King said to me, now, the next movement we're going to have is to institutionalize and internationalize nonviolence. Okay. So now you go on to Washington, and I'll be along later. Well, when I got to Washington, D.C., Walter Fontroy was supposed to be there to pick me up at the airport, take me to the office. He was supposed to work on the press conference. Nobody was there. And when I called back to the office there, the secretary told me that Martin Luther King had been shot. I said, oh my goodness. And I called back, and I couldn't get anybody in Memphis. So I called the media because I knew they would be able to tell me what was happening. So there was a battery of phones around a circle there. And I got AP on the other line, okay? And it was United Press International and the Associated Press. And I had two phones, one in each ear. And they were reading ticker tapes in those days. It's like your fax machine. Ticker tapes. And that's what the message was. And that's how they made telegrams too, the long thing. The white reporter at UPI was reading, and the AP was reading as well. But the white reporter at UPI started sniffling. He had broken down in tears. And that's how I knew Martin Luther King had died. Frankly, I didn't think he would die. He had gotten stabbed in Central Park, and that sort of thing. In fact, a lot of people don't know this, but I'm going to share it. Martin Luther King had a perfect cross over his heart where the, letter opener had stabbed him. It had gone further, it would have pierced his aorta. So, fortunately, he didn't die. He didn't go far enough. But there was a cross there. Well, it was hard for me to deal with his death, but I knew that I had to fulfill the last words, his last wishes, his next movement. So we had to do his funeral, we had to do the portraits campaign, had to do the, before that, we had to do the sanitation workers strike. We had to get that recognized. And we had a lot to do. It was a great burden on us. But I decided that I was going to focus on fulfilling his last, wish. And that is institutionalizing and internationalizing nonviolence. We have nonviolence in 60 countries now, AVP, Alternative to Violence Project. We started in Green Haven, New York, and we had the people started the program in the prisons, and now it's, like I said, it's in 60 countries. That's just one program in nonviolence. So what I do is train people to be trainers. Okay, so that's what I'm interested in, training trainers, so that they could do the training and putting these institutions together and that kind of thing. So that's my role. And
that's great.
We've been to Colombia, Nigeria, South Africa. I helped Mandela get elected president. Okay, and let's see. Oh, yeah, Jane. Jane was with me in Haiti.
Hmm.
We stopped an invasion of Haiti. Our Navy had ships, okay, and was ready to invade Haiti. We went down, and Jane was with me. So she's a witness of everything that happened, okay?
Wow.
And so
That's great. Well, so and that Bernard, that became your motivation, your inspiration, and that's kind of what you have given the rest of your career is to institutionalizing nonviolence, training people to teach nonviolence. So let's fast forward to America 2020, and what we've all seen this summer is we have a lot of peaceful protesters that are making their voice heard. And whether it's over politics, whether it's over police brutality, whether it's over racial tension, but we also have folks that are clearly not committed to nonviolence, and it's been hard for some even to differentiate. Can you make any observations about where we are today in terms of nonviolent protests versus orchestrated violent protests and how they influence and impact, how one not negates, but makes it hard for people to differentiate between the two?
Yes, I'd be glad to, and I appreciate that question, immensely. The first thing that must happen is that we must build coalitions. Those people who are the leaders today have to find a way of coming together with the other leaders. And the thing that I like about what I see is that you do have some leadership. You have spokespersons, you have organizations, okay? When you have organizations, you have leadership. Leadership must come together and form coalitions. In every movement Martin Luther King had, there was always a coalition that he responded to. In Montgomery, MIA, Montgomery Improvement Association, which is made up of a lot of different groups. Selma, Alabama, the Dallas County Voters League. Okay, that was union members, churches, all kind of groups. Youth groups as well. Chicago, CCCO, Coordinating Council of Community Organizations. Arabia. You go down the list. So that's the first thing that must happen. The leadership must come together, because then they have to decide on what is the specific issue. Because there are a lot of issues in terms of racism, and poverty and all the rest of the kind of discriminatory things.
Right.
But you can't work on all of them at the same time. Okay?
Right.
Like Nashville. There were restaurants in Nashville. They didn't demonstrate at the restaurants. They were eating places. They were segregated. Lunch counters. Montgomery bus boycott. Okay? They didn't boycott the downtown stores in Montgomery. Okay? Bus boycott. So my point is, you got to have a specific issue. Then you got to have and identify the power structure. Because that's the power structure that creates, the behavior. It represents a power structure. And so you have to deal with that. And Martin Luther King had a very simple definition for power. Power was the ability to either supply or withdraw needed resources. So you have to define the power. Where is the power? And then the people who are involved in it also contributes to it. Okay? Yeah, we contribute to that. And we have to withdraw our participation from an unjust system. And once you can do that, then you can negotiate with those in the power structure who can make the decision. So that will be the first thing. The next thing is that we must have training of the people who are participating, like marshals. One of the reasons why you have, the disruption and stuff like that is because you don't have marshals. Marshals make all the difference in terms of keeping order to that kind of behavior. I was looking at ways in which we saw marches and stuff back in the 60s and stuff like that. And some people were not aware, but we had trained marshals. It's like I said, the Selma March, you know, we had trained marshals. And so we had in the Chicago movement where our marches were orderly, okay, we had enough trained marshals in places where we didn't, you know, et cetera. Mm-hmm. Now, even the Crips and Bloods in California, Mrs. King, okay, brought the Crips and Blood leaders to Atlanta and trained them. And they went back to LA. That ended the violence among them because you got the leadership. And, you know, that's documented. No question. Mm-hmm. Okay. So there's no substitute for the training. In Colombia, okay, Latin America, we had people who in prison there, okay, in Bella Vista, and they were killing people by the day. The ambulance used to go up in this park to the end of the day and then load up. There were so many of them who killed, not just wounded, killed. That was just one of the whole patterns. We went in and reversed that whole situation. Okay? By training the leadership. So you got to have trained leadership. The next thing is that you must always relate to the media. You can't just go and march. You got to, like, for example, when we had marches and demonstrations in Nashville, we had flyers, which were statements about what we were doing, why we were doing it, okay? And we also had a way of different ways that people could support what we were doing. So my point is you got to communicate with the masses of people if you're going to win them over. You can't just depend on, you know, somebody making a statement to the media. You got to have your own source. Diane Nash, for example, was our spokesperson for the movement in Nashville. She did such a great job. She also was a spokesperson for those of us who continued the Freedom Rides. Mm-hmm. She was an English major, by the way. Okay. And so she could say the same thing 3 different ways.
Right.
Okay. And
so let me ask you this. So, and then I do want to open it up, which will be hard, but I know people have questions for you. What would you, our church, you know, in Nashville, a very predominantly white church, but we are wanting to work hard and do our part to lead and educate and do a better job in this area of racial reconciliation so we can build bridges and be a part of the solution. What advice would you give us, the task force, the leadership? You know, what I mean, a lot of what you just said speaks to it, but what advice would you give us as a church as we seek to do our part to make this better?
Well, there are 3 things. The first one is to identify other organizations, churches, and groups that share the same interests and concern that you have. okay, and form a coalition. In fact, you can name it, okay? Yeah, like they did in the movement in the 60s. Get that, okay? Training, there is no substitute for the training, okay? And then move ahead in terms of identifying groups, organizations, institutions that would respond to the training, who would like to have some training. All right? And particularly, now I'm a stickler for this, the young people. There is no substitute for training young people. One of the people I always tell this, because once you train them, then you have to give them an assignment to go out and do something with the training, not just have it intellectually, and get a certificate. That's not enough. You got to go out. Elementary school in Rhode Island, we had a training there in nonviolence. Once the kids went out for, I heard about this after I left, after I did the training in this school, and some boys were fighting out there on the playground during the recess period. 6-year-old little white girl got all the students out there on the playground to join hands and make a circle around the boys who were fighting and start singing the national anthem. Okay? Now, it's not impossible, but it's kind of hard for boys to fight each other, okay, in the national anthem.
Right.
So they ended up joining hands with the rest of the students. So instead of balling up their fists, fighting each other, here they were holding hands. Mm-hmm. So it's what you do with your hands. What you do with your hands depends on what you do with your heart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's a change of heart is what we're looking for.
That's right.
So I would say that the coalition building, the training, and then pick out a particular issue, because even though you're working on one issue, it speaks to all the others. Mm-hmm. So you're not ignoring the other problems. What you're doing is showing people an example of how you approach it.
Okay. That's great. I'd like to, our goal is to try to finish up, by 8. So I'd like to go ahead and open it up. I know we will not get to all the questions tonight, but if you have a question for Dr. Lafayette, would you either raise your hand on the screen? Amber is going to be helping me. Karen, you're one of the chairs of the task force, so I'll call on you first. Karen Woolridge.
Thank you. Dr. Lafayette, I heard you speak one time and you talked about when you all were arrested, I don't remember where, but there were songs that you sang in jail, and when the jail keepers were really trying to be harsh with you, you stayed nonviolent, and I'm hoping that you can remember that story that you told, and if you could repeat it.
Well, there were a couple of incidents. One was when we first got to jail in Jackson, Mississippi. Jim Bevel and Joe Carter from Brooklyn, New York. We were part of a quartet from the seminary, and we started singing. Even though there were 3 of us, we got somebody else to be the bass, because our bass didn't come with us. And we were singing "Buses Are Coming." And the jailer came and said, "All right, give me that radio." Give me that radio. So Bevel, who was kind of an unusual fellow, turned around. "We're not going to give you our radio. You're not going to take our radio." So the jailer said, "I'll be doggone, he's a Mississippi jailer. You know what I mean? He's supposed to have reputation. So a lot of things they don't have to do because their reputation precedes them, okay? Mississippi." So he went and got a whole bunch of fellows, and they started, jailers, and they started coming into our cell. I said, Bevel, look, no sense getting us beaten up for nothing. So Bevel turned around and told him, said, all right, we'll give you the radio. And I was hoping we sound as good the second time as we did the first time. So we started singing, buses are a-coming, oh yes. Buses are a-coming, oh yes. Buses are a-coming, buses are a-coming, buses are a-coming, oh yes. Apparently we sound as good the second time.
I think you sound great, Bernard. That sounds really good. All right, let's go to Roy has a question. Unmute.
Right, I got to unmute. Could you, Bernard, Dr. Lafayette, could you give just a quick overview of the last 50, 60 years and what effects, major effects of the civil rights movements back in the 60s, 70s, what things you have seen that have been affected by it and what ways better, what ways worse?
Well, I would just have to give sort of a summary of that. One of the things is that the legal separation in certain parts of our country have been abolished. In other words, they no longer are in place as policies. Now, the irony is this: interstate travel, no new law was passed to end segregation on buses, interstate buses. It was Robert Kennedy who simply reached and got the ICC ruling, Interstate Commerce Commission. They had to do with commerce. So the buses, in terms of your paying fare to go from one state to another, interstate commerce. Okay? So that was changed. Guess what? The law still has not been changed for intrastate travel. You go from one city to another in the same state, okay? In certain states, they have not changed the law. We just don't enforce it. Because it's kind of hard to enforce a law like that, and you're going to put some of the black people in the back and some of them in the front. So they go back in front, okay? So that's a pretty interesting idea. Maybe some law students might get together and file a suit or something, get some laws changed, but right now it's still, okay, a law that has not been changed. So the next thing is that we have been able to find more coalitions among black and white people. That's what you see now in the streets now. You always saw some white people participating in the movement. And in fact, in Selma, Alabama, more white people were killed in the Selma movement, okay, than blacks. The other thing is that in Selma, Alabama, no black church was bombed. That was not true in Montgomery. It was not true in Birmingham.
Yeah.
No black home was bombed. No school was bombed. And yet the Selma movement made a tremendous impact in terms of, the voter registration, movement and the right to vote. No bomb. All right? And I know why. The next thing is that interracial organizations, we see more of them now than we did back in the pre-movement period. Now, some people are absolutely surprised that we see all of the racist behavior and racist action and that sort of thing during this period when we just had, for the first time in the history of our country, a black African American president for 2 terms. Where did all this stuff come from? Well, I'm going to tell you, the research that I've done tells me that the white people who go along with the system that we experience now with all of the racism and stuff that we talk about, the whites are more afraid of the whites than they are the blacks. Black folks are not going around shooting up white folks and in their homes and bombing places and stuff. No, not black folks. Okay? So therefore, we got to look at why is it that whites are so afraid of the minority of whites who behave that way? And it's because of the level of violence and the extent that they will go to silence you. So they feel uncomfortable, the whites themselves. Now, if we can help them to gain the courage, and I think I see it happening, because when you look at these marches and demonstrations, first of all, you see a significant number of white people out there, okay? And the different generations. And you got white folks out there with all kind of hairdos. So you can tell the different, generations there. And the other thing that I see that makes me have all the confidence that we're going to succeed is you see women leaders coming forward. They've always been there, but hey, not like this. Women, black and white and other colors and ethnic groups and all that kind of thing, etc. They are there with, the male leaders and taking a stand. So I have all the confidence that things are not going to be the same, but there's no substitute for the training that's needed.
All right, got time for maybe 1 or 2 more before we close down tonight. Anybody have a question for Dr. Lafayette? Jenny Simmons.
Dr. Lafayette, it's an honor to speak to you and just such a great privilege for you to be with us tonight. I just want to thank you for your service and thank you to your wife too, for both of you. I have my daughters here with me, and you talk about courage, and we've been listening on. I guess I'd ask you, what do you say to students who are learning to use their voice, who are a bit afraid, or even adults for that matter, to speak up, and the best way to confront injustice and to use their voice in a way that's healthy and non-combative, but also to sort of get over that fear?
Well, the thing that I would focus on is helping young people decide on their goal in life. You're not too young. Remember, I was 7 years old, okay? Yeah. So as they struggle to look at their goal, then they form their purpose. So there's a goal in life, but in order to move towards that goal, you have to feel that you have some value, that you are worth something. And your worth is based on what you are worth to others. We don't know how long we're going to live. So we have to look at what we can contribute to life and start working on that now. thinking about it. Like a little girl, a 6-year-old who formed a circle. Put it into action. Don't wait until, you know. So my point is that if we can help leave something that's going to be worthwhile to others, and that is looking at every step that we make and determining whether or not that step represents the goal we're trying to reach. So we're going in the right direction. And that way we can make sure that when people act in a very negative way, in a hateful way, that means we must be positive and we must be loving. Because we must reflect, okay, in our own behavior, the goal that we want to reach. And others will see that. And one of the things that is important is to be concerned how people see you. So you look into their eyes, all right? And then you look into their eyes, then you determine what you want them to see. Don't let them, okay, see us act, you know, like them. So we want to be able to show that we are all human beings and we have the same, okay, bodies, same goals, same, okay. We have more in common than not.
Mm-hmm.
And so we don't have to be thinking about the differences. Think about the things we have in common, and let's focus on those things.
All right, let's one more, and then we're going to close down. I see Rod. You get the final question tonight, Rod.
All
There you
right,
go.
sorry, a little slow on the draw there. Dr. Lafayette, how did you go through decades of some of the most difficult years in the history of this country and maintain your dignity and maintain a sense of calm and peace about you that just overwhelms me?
Well, I not only believed that change was possible, I helped to make it possible. So I was working on change because I believed that we could accomplish those goals. It's like the 6 principles that Martin Luther King talked about. The last one is that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. We may not see the goal we're trying to reach now, but we've got to believe that it's possible to achieve that goal. And the thing that makes it possible is the fact that we're working on it. So it has to be consistent. And I have seen so many others do the same thing. And so that's why I have the smile on my face, because I'm going to take my medication so I can see what this next generation is going to do. Okay? And that's why I was saying earlier, I'm so excited about these young people. I can't tell you. And guess what? It's not just our people, in this country. Have you seen what's happening around the rest of the world? Oh my goodness. So they see the oneness and the wonderfulness of who we are as a people. So we're not limited to this country. People around the country are with us.
That's right.
And sharing.
Bernard, I think that is a great one to end on. I want to thank everybody for joining tonight. I want to thank Jane for introducing Bernard. It has been an honor and a privilege, Bernard, to have your beautiful bride with you as well. Thank you, Kate, for being with us. And I want to thank everybody for being a part of this. And Bernard, if it's not too much to ask, could I ask you to close us with a short prayer? And please know how much we appreciate this time tonight. It's been so special for all of us.
Thank you. Father, we thank you for all the generosity and love that you share with us. We pray, oh God, that you would give us the strength to endure. Give us the fortitude and give us the mission. We pray, oh God, that this group, all of us, will find ways in which we can express your love towards your people. And we pray, oh God, that we'll never give up. No, we'll never give up. And we thank you for all the strength that you give us for us to continue. In your name we pray. Amen.